Thank you, Paul. And sort of following on from the early signs of disease, I think this is an amazing opportunity with Biobank. I'm going to call on James Rowe, who's going to beam in, hopefully, from Cambridge, who's going to talk about that in supranuclear palsy. Here he is. Over to you, James.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to join you. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I'm hoping the tech is working all right. And I'll get my first slide up. So I'm going to really talk in very general terms around the need and the opportunities to find pre-diagnostic and even pre-symptomatic disease. And we're very familiar with this lifespan perspective of different pathogenic processes evolving for, in this case, Alzheimer's, but the same equivalent graphs could be drawn for any of the neurodegenerative diseases, focusing not just on that late stage dementia Parkinsonism, or even those mild transitional prodromal phases, but thinking around the very early pre-symptomatic period when there may be most opportunity to intervene to treat the causative process and prevent disease. Now, the opportunities to do this depend on the type of disease you have. So if one has a common disease such as Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease, it's possible to do this through population screening or by looking closely at the number of large cohorts of healthy aging that the UK has really a very strong history in. But this is the approach taken by Dementia's Platform UK and made even stronger through the Biobank data. For other diseases such as frontotemporal dementia, where there's a very strong autosomal dominant component, you can take other strategies. You can look at the children or siblings of probands who then we know to carry the disease, the highly penetrant diseases. You can look at those individuals in the decades before symptoms come on. This is the approach taken, for example, by the Genetic FTD initiative. But for rare diseases which have no autosomal dominant causes, neither of these approaches are possible. So a disease like progressive supranuclear palsy, cortical basal degeneration, and indeed many others, you cannot take these two strategies and you need something different. And this is where Biobank really excels as an opportunity. So I'm going to focus first on this condition known as progressive supranuclear palsy. It's a very aggressive dementia Parkinsonism complex. It's non-familial. There are no autosomal dominant genes. It has some partial overlap with those with mapped mutations, but really it's a distinctive illness, and it really essentially does not run in families. It's a very aggressive disease. Although it typically takes 3 years from symptoms to diagnosis, from diagnosis to death is again only 3 years. Now, we know something from epidemiological studies around the incidence of PSP, both in the UK and from a European-wide study that's currently in press. If we look at the incidence, that's the number of new cases per 100,000 people per age range, this incidence rises from the age of 50 onwards, and in fact reaching a peak in the early 70s, perhaps increasing even into 80s and 90s, but that may be lost to the epidemiology. But if we look at this epidemiological incidence and we think about the number of people in the Biobank who were healthy when they came in 2006 to 2010, and then over the subsequent 12 years of follow-up and their age range, we can actually estimate there should be around, by now, 200 people with this rare neurodegenerative disease, progressive supranuclear palsy. And Duncan Street then looked at this in detail with a census data at the end of 2020, and indeed found 176 people with progressive supranuclear palsy. This compares to 2,500 people with idiopathic Parkinson's disease. And just to illustrate the power of this approach and what Biobank is so powerful for this is as many patients as in a symptom-based national study cohort based in specialist clinics for PSP who've been recruiting over some years. And still, Biobank has more patients than we have in that national longitudinal phenotyping cohort. Now, one thing to note is around half of the cases were identified from primary care records, and we know that around half of primary care records are not yet connected into Biobank. So that would tell us we're probably missing around 100 cases of PSP who in due course will eventually be picked up in secondary care records, and we can look at more closely. But we're going to focus on this 176 patients with PSP. They're very typical in many of their characteristics, but what's really important here is the average interval from when they were assessed by the Biobank team to when they got their diagnosis was nearly 8 years, 7.8 years. And many of them indeed had lived for a couple of years under an incorrect diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, which is typical in real-world cohorts in the health service as well. So let's look at what these individuals had. Well, if we look at the time, these are Kaplan-Meier survival plots, looking at the time from that baseline biobank assessment to the diagnosis. The 50th centile, the median person was at just 7.8 years. But what we know from studies around the world in the UK, or in multiple European countries and North America, is it takes 2.5 to 3 years from symptoms to diagnosis. So it's a reasonable assumption that the biobank assessment was on average 4 years before those first symptoms, in order to be at least 4, in order to be 7 or 8 years before diagnosis. Once the diagnosis was put forward, what we see is very typical, and it brings home the devastating nature of PSP, that 50% mortality at 2.5 years and around 12 years for Parkinson's disease. If we then look at the time from assessment to death, what we see is on the right panel there, it's around 10, 11 years from the biobank baseline assessment to death from PSP at the median person. Very typical time course for sporadic disease in healthcare and other community studies. But what were these patients looking like at baseline? So we think they're at least 4 or 5 years before symptoms, given that they're 7 or 8 years before diagnosis. Well, what we see is already at that point, many years before symptoms, on top left-hand panel shows this Biobank's self-rated health score. And we can see, in contrast to those in black who are healthy controls matched from the Biobank, those in PSP are less likely to rate their health as excellent or even good, and more likely to rate it as fair or poor. So already there's some subjective sense of declining health. We look at motor function, so reaction time, grip strength. They're also abnormal, they're diminished in PSP compared to controls. And fluid intelligence is also reduced. This is, I think, a very interesting result because it speaks to the loss of executive function and fluid intelligence that's characteristic of PSP in the diagnostic process once people declare their symptoms. So in some ways, they've got motor deficits and cognitive deficits and subjective health, poor health, 7 to 8 years before diagnosis, 4 or 5 years before symptoms. We don't know from the biobank data when their first symptoms are, but we can make that reasonable assumption. So we can do this for PSP, even a rare non-autosomal dominant disease. And then with Tim Ritwell, we then widened this approach to look at other neurodegenerative diseases. And indeed, the same thing holds true, whether we're looking at Alzheimer's disease, so very common, or Parkinson's disease, sporadic neurodegenerative disease, or less common frontotemporal dementia, progressive supranuclear palsy, or even Lewy body disease. What we see is around 7 to 8 years before diagnosis, and again, this means 4 or 5 years before likely first symptoms, we're seeing a reduction in fluid intelligence, increase in reaction times, and a decline in overall health rating. An interesting exception there being multiple system atrophy, which might have a later and more aggressive onset and not be being picked up quite so early. So just to draw this together, I think I want to highlight that the Biobank is now seeing very high rates of sporadic neurodegenerative disease, even rare diseases. The extraordinary ambition 15 years ago to recruit at such a large scale has meant, through waiting, we're now seeing even PSP, frontotemporal dementia, MSA, emerging in significant numbers. And this gives us a chance to look at the antecedents to not only common dementias and degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease, but also those rare disorders. The patients that are being detected in the UK Biobank series are in other ways typical. They'd have typical survival, their other clinical features look very similar, where we can look at this individually. So I think it's a safe assumption that they are representative of the background population of these patient groups. And that makes it really important that there really is no other way that we could assess those cognitive, motor and health status functions so many years before symptom onset, not for a non-genetic rare disease. Just like to thank the team who helped me with this work at the Centre for Parkinson Plus, highlighting Duncan Street in the circle there, and the team from Dementias Platform UK, but perhaps most importantly, this extraordinary team at Biobank who really enabled this type of project. And thank you for listening.